always known that my grandfather was in the military during World War II. His house was full of memories of that time. A photograph of him in uniform, a statue of a paratrooper, an old machete, and a ceramic square with his name and his words Philippine written on it. But he rarely spoke of this war with us, his grandchildren. Of course, I knew that, like many of his generation, his life changed brutally as Pearl Harbor happened, that many Americans died on the beach of Normandy or in the Pacific, but I knew little of his life during that time. So on a frigid winter day, I sat down with my father and asked him to tell me some details of my grandfather's life during that time.
He was first in the artillery because your grandfather was a little older and he knew how to organize people. He had run businesses and he went into the artillery and he wanted to go to war more directly, so he volunteered for the paratroops. And he became a paratrooper at the end of 1942. He was in the 82nd Airborne in Fort Bragg. He was happy to be in the Army. He met a lot of guys, mainly officers. He had a lot of responsibility. And so he was learning how to jump out of airplanes and stuff like that, and he thought it was cool. But in September 1943, your grandfather broke his leg. He was actually in a special division in the paratrooper division where they tested parachutes. Just kind of a crazy job, isn't it? Yes. And they did other things to test equipment that was going to be thrown out of parachutes. And he fell, and he landed on the ground, and he badly broke his leg. So he had to go to a hospital for almost 6 months while his leg got better. And so his group, his regiment, shipped out to Europe at the end of 1943, and he was in the hospital. So he was detached from his unit, and he didn't go to D-Day. Otherwise, he would have. Philippines right at the end of the war in Europe in April 1945. And when he arrived in the Philippines, he was made the head of what was called K number 1. And he was in charge of the largest K in Manila, where ships were still coming in at the end of the war. And he had to unload the ships, and he had lots of people working for him. And he had to prepare stuff as though they were going to stay in the war. It was very complicated. And he was also responsible for Japanese prisoners of war who worked on the K.
Was he ever in contact with native population there?
In fact, he was. As you can see in some of the pictures, there's a machete that someone gave him because he used to go into the hills north of Manila, and he would do things with the population. He once told me that he was invited to a feast, but he thought it was very strange because they were eating dogs.
And what was the most formative experience of his life? The Great War or World War II? Why?
Well, I asked your grandfather that question once, and he said that the Depression was the most important experience of his life, that he had to go live by himself and take care of himself. And unlike your grandfather in France, who lived through World War II, and that was a very, very hard time, your grandfather and your grandmother in the United States both would tell you, if they were here today, that the Depression was more important because they actually had to get by here. And so he would tell you that the Depression was important to him because he moved away for almost 8 or 9 years and lived on his own.
Thank you.